Once inside, the veterinary assistant took Bonnie into a room to do the prep work for her first dialysis treatment. While there are many different reasons for renal failure or failure of the kidneys, in this episode, I'm concentrating on the toxins that can cause this disease because those are the things that you can control.
If you're passionate about Basset hounds, this podcast is for you.
This is WOEBGON, the Basset Hound podcast with your host Don Bullock.
Hi there, and welcome to WOEBGON, the Basset Hound podcast. I'm your host, Don Bullock. This is episode 15 of the podcast. In the last episode, I shared the second part of Bonnie's story, where she developed an issue with total renal failure. So I'd suggest you go back and check out that episode before listening to the following. Before I go any farther, I'd like to apologize to especially those of you on YouTube that were expecting this to come out on time. I'm sorry for the delay. We've just had a hectic month this month, and it was sort of topped off when on the 19th we had a new puppy arrive. So I just haven't had time to get back to the video. We've also had a couple of dog shows. So my apologies. I'm hoping to get the audio version out on time, but it may be delayed as well. So my sincere apologies for the lateness of this. Oh, and another reason this episode is a little late is Pam is a big Los Angeles Dodgers baseball fan. Now, I know some of you in other countries are like, what? What is that? Well, don't worry about it. But she's a big fan, and of course, they've been in the playoffs and just won the World Series. Yeah, I've had people in other countries say, what do you mean World Series? It's not worldwide. Well, that's what it's called. But they just won the World Series, which is the absolute ultimate in baseball, or American baseball as we know it. And so we've been watching all of those games, and that took up some of my recording time. Sorry about that. For the third part of her story, after we discovered she was suffering total renal failure, I'll share what happened with Bonnie, plus more about what total renal failure is, as well as some of the causes. There are things that you may have in your home that can cause renal failure. This part might just help prevent that from happening to your dog. At the end of episode 14, we had just driven Bonnie down to the companion animal dialysis unit near San Diego, California, and they rolled her on a gurney from the parking lot towards their facility. I sort of left you hanging. The following story is what happened after we went inside the hemodialysis unit. Once inside, the veterinary assistant took Bonnie into a room to do the prep work for her first dialysis treatment, while we went over the paperwork with the veterinarian, and she also explained what was happening. Of course, the costs involved was also a big part of what the conversation was all about. We were talking about costs in the thousands of dollars. Since Bonnie was young, Pam and I decided whatever the costs were, we'd take a chance that they could save her. After that decision had been made and we signed all the papers, we were escorted by another veterinarian assistant to an adjoining veterinary hospital where we had to go through another set of instructions, paperwork, provide credit card information. Yes, a lot more costs were involved there as well, and signatures for the care Bonnie would need when the dialysis treatments were being performed on her in the dialysis unit. By the time we were done with all of that, Bonnie was already hooked up to their special dialysis machine and getting her first treatment. No, I don't have any photos. I didn't have a camera with me. Besides, we were way too busy with other things, and we had other things on our mind besides taking pictures. I have no idea what time we left Bonnie. We knew she was in excellent care, and we had classes to teach the next morning, and we had a long drive home. Sometime after we got home, It was over a 2-hour drive. We were in bed asleep and received a call from the veterinary assistant to let us know that Bonnie had successfully completed her first treatment and was resting well in the veterinary hospital. She assured us that they would be closely monitoring Bonnie. My memory again fails me as to how long things took. As I can best remember, the dialysis treatments were 3 days apart. Whatever the time frame was, Bonnie was placed on what I recall was their aggressive protocol. It really doesn't matter how many days went by. To us, it seemed like an eternity. The next weekend, Pam and I decided to go down and visit Bonnie and get some updates from her veterinarians. One thing we were told is that there was a possibility that Bonnie might need dialysis treatments every 3 or 4 days for an undetermined period of time. This is something we hadn't counted on. These treatments would have to be done at San Diego or Sacramento locations. The only other companion animal dialysis unit located in the country was somewhere in the middle of the United States. I think it was Michigan, but I don't remember. Yes, at that time, there were only 3 locations in the entire country where dialysis was being used on companion animals. We were suddenly struck by the possibility that we'd have to figure out how to get Bonnie down to San Diego every 3 or 4 days, wait several hours for the treatment to be administered, and drive her home. Or we'd have to find somewhere in the area where Bonnie could stay when we weren't able to drive down there to pick her up. That concept was mind-boggling. The veterinarians and other hospital staff said they'd help us figure things out when the time came. At this point, all that had to wait until Bonnie started eating. That was a big concern that we're starting to work on now that Bonnie had had a couple of dialysis treatments. The following Monday morning, I received a call from the veterinary assistant from the dialysis unit. The call came in during my recess break. The message was that Bonnie had been released by the dialysis unit, and that's essentially all she said. As I recall, I was confused as to why she had released Bonnie from the care of their service, and I called her back. The veterinary assistant stated that after the 3rd dialysis treatment, they were certain that Bonnie had recovered from her urinary tract failure. She had full function with urinating and was being dismissed from their care. After additional discussions with her, I found out that Bonnie would remain in the care of the veterinary hospital because Bonnie needed to stay on her IV and liquid feeding tubes until she could eat on her own. Pam and I arranged to go down to see Bonnie and talk to the veterinarians over the following weekend. Since our co-breeder Heather and her parents lived fairly close to the hospital, we arranged to stay at her parents' home on Saturday night so we could visit Bonnie both days. When we arrived at the hospital Saturday morning, we were escorted into a room. The veterinary assistant told us she'd bring Bonnie in to see us. Several minutes later, Bonnie entered the room. It was wonderful to see her up and walking around. While Bonnie was very thin from losing a lot of weight and she still had tubes sticking out, we didn't care. She looked wonderful to us. We let Bonnie walk around the room and explore the room. She had been through a lot, and it took her a while to warm up to us. No, she didn't recognize us at first. Then suddenly there was a big puddle on the floor of the room. Now, over the years, having dogs, especially young ones, we've seen a lot of puddles on the floor. This one was different. Suddenly, we realized that Bonnie had just peed a huge puddle on the floor. We called the assistant in, and she was both surprised and excited. Right there on the floor, all the proof that we needed that Bonnie's urinary problems were over for certain. The assistant let us walk Bonnie down the hallway while she cleaned up the mess. With all the mess cleaned up, she took us with Bonnie down to the dialysis unit where we could talk to them. Of course, our first question was, when can we take her home? The response was, whenever they could get Bonnie to eat. The explanation that we received is that patients couldn't be released from the hospital until they were eating food and therefore could be removed from the feeding tubes and the regimen that they were on. In Bonnie's case, it seemed like no matter what they tried to feed her, she wouldn't eat anything. It was suggested that when we came back later that day to visit Bonnie, that we'd bring something that might entice her to eat. While all this discussion was going on, Bonnie had already been returned to the hospital so that she could be hooked up to her feeding tubes. Before we left, we stopped to see her and arranged to come back later in the day. Pam and I knew of a great restaurant nearby. We stopped there many times after dog shows that were held at the Del Mar Fairgrounds. I think I got something with roast beef, and I remember Pam ordered chicken for lunch. We went back to the hospital at the prearranged time. They put a harness on Bonnie because anything else would have interfered with where they had shaved her neck and inserted the tubes to be used for the dialysis. We were given permission to take Bonnie outside to a large lawn area in front of the hospital. Once we got out to the grass, Bonnie started warming up to us. She was still very weak, but was responding more to what we said and did as time went on. She loved walking around in the grass and sniffing everything, a typical Basset Hound behavior. I walked her while Pam prepared chicken that she'd saved from lunch. Bonnie had experienced chicken in her dinner on occasions in the past, so we thought it would be something that she'd be somewhat familiar with. We had absolutely no success with the chicken. Bonnie didn't get even close enough to sniff it. Pam tried putting some in her mouth, but that didn't work either. We got the same reaction with the roast beef from my lunch. Bonnie just refused to try to eat anything that we had. We noticed that Bonnie was getting weak from the venture outside, so we returned her to the hospital. We asked to talk to the veterinarian in charge of her care and waited for him to talk to us. Of course, we were perplexed with the eating problem. He explained that it wasn't unusual, but he was very concerned. He suggested that we come back the next day and try to get Bonnie to eat again. One of the hospital's administrators also joined in the conversation because we questioned the costs involved for Bonnie's care. She explained how much it would cost per day for Bonnie to stay with them. I'm sure all of you have had dogs in hospitals and you can relate. The cost for Bonnie's treatment and care was adding up quickly. We stayed with Heather's parents overnight and returned to the hospital the next morning. While we also took along something we thought Bonnie might eat, we were again unsuccessful. We did, however, spend most of the morning with Bonnie out on the lawn. Before we left, we again talked to Bonnie's doctor. We asked him to give us an update every day, and he agreed. What he didn't make clear is that the updates would be at the end of his shift when he was free to sit down and make calls. Most nights that week, they became between 10 p.m. and midnight, and more were close to midnight than 10 p.m. As the week went on, there was little or no change. The costs kept adding up. Finally, on Friday, I told him we could no longer afford to keep Bonnie there. We made it clear to them that we wanted to bring Bonnie home and we'd be responsible for getting her to eat. We didn't have any other choice. It was just getting too expensive. I've been in touch with Sue Shoemaker, whom I've mentioned before. She knew a lot about Bassets. Sue had suggested that we get a bag of puppy food and hand feed Bonnie. At this point, it was our only choice. The veterinary costs were already over $14,000 and rising. I have to add, at the time we had no idea where the money was coming from. We drove down to the hospital Saturday morning to pick Bonnie up. I specifically remember it was Saturday morning because we stopped to see a lot of our friends at a Basset Hound specialty show on the way to the hospital. It was real close by. The hospital wouldn't be ready until 10 a.m. When we reached the hospital, we had a very long discussion regarding Bonnie. Had to sign some documents, especially releasing the hospital from any liability if we couldn't get Bonnie to eat, and we had to also pay our bill. Bonnie had been taken down to the dialysis unit so the staff there could say goodbye to her. Sorry, this is a tough part. I'm sorry I got a little emotional there. Telling the second part of Bonnie's story is even a little more difficult than telling the first part. It's hard to bring it back, all of those memories. They had made up a special scarf for her. The vet and her assistant in the hemodialysis unit had cut out the back of one of their scrub shirts that they wear and made it into a scarf for Bonnie. It said, "Congratulations, Bonnie." Then along the edge it said, "Dialysis Graduate." And in the center is a heart with "We love you." It was a wonderful thing for them to do. We still have the scarf. It's in Bonnie's album with all her win photos and a lot of the other memorabilia from Bonnie's life. It's a very special thing for us. They were so proud of what they were able to accomplish with Bonnie. We had a good conversation with the vet and her assistant. The professor at the University of California at Davis who had developed the program and the adjustments necessary to allow dialysis machines designed to work on people to work on small animals was also visiting, making some adjustments to the machines. He gave us some interesting information and was excited that he had developed a program that would help Bonnie. He told me that in his opinion, Bonnie's chances to live was quite a bit less than 50-50 when she arrived, and he was thrilled that she was doing so well. While Bonnie's initial tests showed that she had had a positive reaction to antifreeze, we were able to assure them that she hadn't been exposed to antifreeze. They concluded through some helpful research from our regular veterinarian that she was most likely poisoned by the antibiotic that he had administered. He was able to determine that other breeds besides Basset hounds had suffered renal failure during tests of the drug. According to him, the research report now includes Basset hounds. He was sure that the information on that dog database had been changed. And later on, I checked. Before we left, we thanked everyone for their work to revive Bonnie and took some photos. I'll have some photos on the website, and there are a few here, and I'll leave a little space for that for those of you that are watching the video. This is the veterinary assistant who performed most of the dialysis treatments on Bonnie. Then she was joined on the floor with Bonnie with the veterinarian that was in charge of the program down in San Diego. Both of these ladies were just fantastic to work with, and I understand that the veterinarian assistant has gone on to become a veterinarian herself. Here are some photos of some of the older dialysis machines. As I recall, the one they used on Bonnie was very similar to the one on the right. I mentioned earlier, from what I understood, there were only 3 hemodialysis units in the United States when Bonnie was being treated. Today, due to modern technology, they have hemodialysis units for companion animals in many different places. These photos are just a few examples of the machines that they're using today. With all of that done, the dialysis vet and her assistant, the two who had unloaded Bonnie that first night, helped us load her back in the van. We headed for home. On the way home, Pam and I stopped somewhere to get a hamburger. We offered a piece of one of the patties to Bonnie with no success. She didn't like the French fries either. Before we left, we set up an exercise pen in the family room for Bonnie. She settled in and was glad to be home. We were certainly glad to have her home. As suggested by Sue Shoemaker, that evening we used the puppy food and made some what we called puppy balls that I discussed in an earlier podcast. Sue had taught us how when puppies who weren't eating well, sometimes we could feed them little puppy balls, and that would help to get them through that stage where they get stubborn and don't want to eat as much as they should. Anyway, I had become familiar with the sort of force-feeding puppies. I balled up some of Bonnie's food and placed it deep in her mouth to a point where she had to swallow it. That procedure was repeated until she had swallowed what we would call a normal meal. It was a slow process that required a lot of care and time, but it worked. Fortunately, she kept the food down. Bonnie, however, was still very thin. About day 3, after reading the package's portions suggested for dogs, I called Sue. I told her there was no way I could stuff that much food into Bonnie, and it was becoming frustrating to keep feeding her this way. As usual, Sue encouraged me to keep trying and to increase the efforts to get Bonnie to eat on her own. I have to add here that Sue was a wonderful friend, and her constant encouragement and advice was extremely valuable during this whole ordeal. We dearly miss her. Pam had already started offering food to Bonnie in her food bowl. Unfortunately, Bonnie wouldn't make any effort to even get close to the bowl. She wouldn't even eat it off the floor, which is something that dogs will do when they won't eat out of a bowl. That was continued every meal. We kept trying. This was back when the internet was new. I was a member of several Basset Hound email lists. That's way before Facebook, folks. On the internet, breeders and other Basset Hound owners from literally all over the world suggested things to try to feed Bonnie. Pam continued to fix and try almost everything that those people suggested. She even cooked some liver. We still couldn't get Bonnie to eat on her own. This seemed to go on for weeks. I've lost track now of how long we went through this routine of me force-feeding Bonnie and Pam trying to entice her to eat on her own. It just went on forever. One afternoon, we finally got our first breakthrough. Bonnie acted interested in something that Pam had fixed and actually took a small bite. Then she took a couple more. No, I have no idea what it was. We've lost track over the years as to what it was that started Bonnie eating. It was still several days, perhaps as much as a week, before she would eat on a regular basis. The next weekend, we took Bonnie out for a visit to the Basset Hound Club of Southern California match. It was her first time out in public since this whole ordeal had started. Everyone was amazed to see her and how well she looked after going through what she had endured. At the match, Joe Newmeyer, a prominent Southern California Basset Hound breeder, paid Bonnie a great compliment when she explained to another breeder that no other Basset Hound she knew would have survived what Bonnie had gone through. In the March-April edition of the California Veterinarian the following year, there was an article about the hemodialysis unit in San Diego. Part of that article was a section all about Bonnie's story. We were thrilled to see that Bonnie's story had been spread to many veterinarians throughout California. I'll place copies of this article on our website so all of you can read it. Pam and I are certainly grateful to all the veterinarians who contributed to saving her life and giving us such a wonderful girl. As I mentioned in episode 14, as school teachers, we didn't make a lot of money. Somehow we were able to pay off all of Bonnie's medical expenses in a reasonable period of time. Thanks to Sue Shoemaker, we did get some help. Sue started collecting money from many of our friends. While the amount of money wasn't substantial when compared to our bills, it was enough to help us cover a lot of costs associated with Bonnie's situation. We used it to pay for our gasoline and meals for our trips to visit Bonnie, plus some other related costs. We greatly appreciated their help. It took a while for Bonnie to fully recover from her bout with total renal failure. I kept showing her afterwards with great success. She ended up being the number 15 Basset Hound in the United States before Heather finally began showing her. Her duties showing somebody else's dog ended, and she was able to take over showing Bonnie. She also gave us a wonderful litter of puppies, but those are stories for a future podcast. Now, before I go on, I'd like to say that the last of that line of our Basset Hounds, our Heidi, we lost yesterday. And it's very sad, but we lost the last of the Bassets that we personally had that we bred. And losing Heidi was a very, very sad day. I even have here Heidi's collar, and it has her name tag on it. She was our little butterfly. There's a butterfly on there. What I'm going to be doing today is taking this off of her collar that she used, and I'm going to be putting that on a collar that we have hanging in the entry to our home, the choke chain that was used for our very first dog, Ruffy, many years ago when we brought him home from the pound, when we rescued him. And I have on this all of the tags for all of their dogs, starting with Ruffy. For example, this one is Heidi's mother, Snow White, Snowy. And so this is the collar that we used on Ruffy many, many years ago. And Heidi's name tag will go on this, and this hangs in the entry to our home. And people can see that as they come by. And I also have there hanging, this is the first leash that we ever had. This is what they gave us to take Ruffy home with. When we picked him up at the shelter, they gave us this rope collar. Yeah, you can see how long ago that was. Now they use nylon collars that they buy in bulk. But this was just a collar made out of twine, really, literally. And that's what we brought him home from the shelter with. So I have that hanging out there. So Heidi's name tag will eventually join with this, and I'll get that on there today. So in case you're wondering, Heidi was part of Snow White's 7 dwarf litter. Yes, we had a dog we named Snow White, and she had 7 puppies. So we named all the puppies after the dwarfs. And I don't remember which Heidi was, but she was one of the 7 dwarfs as a puppy name. So yes, we lost Heidi yesterday. Snow White, or Snowy as we called her, was out of Bonnie. So Bonnie's granddaughter is the one that we lost yesterday. And it was a very sad day, but it's one of those things we all have to face as dog owners. They just don't live long enough. Now, as an aside, as far as Heidi's concerned, at the dog show this weekend, Pam was talking to a friend about her, and she remembered that Heidi's dwarf name, when she was one of the 7 dwarfs from Snow White's litter, was Grumpy. And we have no idea why we picked Grumpy for her as a puppy. Maybe she was the grumpy one in the litter. It sort of fit Heidi in some ways because Heidi was a little more aloof than some Bassets can be. There was nothing wrong with that. She was a wonderful girl. We loved having her around the house. But she could just be a little more aloof, more like a cat-like features than a Basset Hound kind of features as far as temperament was concerned. And some of the times I've had episodes that have been interrupted because I've had howling when Pam's left the building. Well, Heidi was the instigator of all of that, usually. And since we've lost Heidi, we don't have that. Pam just went to the store this morning and there was nothing, no howling when she left. So we're going to miss her. We're going to miss her dearly. Now on to some important things that you need to know. What are the toxins you need to know about that may cause total renal failure? I have to add here that what happened to Bonnie is a very unique and isolated situation. What I've said so far and will say in this podcast should not be considered in any way to be medical advice. I am not a licensed veterinarian and I know very little about the subject of renal failure. I only know what I've researched and what the doctors have told me. What I'm presenting in the following section is simply some information based on that research and the information people have given me that I think may help you, my listeners, to possibly avoid what happened to Bonnie. If you have any questions or concerns about renal failure, you should always visit or call your veterinarian. They are your best resource to ensure the health and well-being of your pets. If you suspect renal failure, your nearest emergency veterinarian hospital may be your only hope to save your dog. Time is of the essence in some cases. While there are many different reasons for renal failure or failure of the kidneys, in this episode, I'm concentrating on the toxins that can cause this disease because those are the things that you can control. This is the section that all of you need to especially pay attention to and one you might want to research more as well as discuss with your veterinarian. Many normal household items, including some human foods, can damage the kidneys. We know dogs like to lick stuff, eat stuff, and roll in stuff, or even bathe in stuff, but that can put them at risk for kidney failure. Depending on what type of kidney toxin is the culprit, the most common clinical signs for kidney poisoning include not eating, drooling, vomiting, bloody diarrhea, black tarry stool, lethargy, bad breath with halitosis that's secondary to the buildup of kidney poisons, excessive thirst and urination, decreased urination, seizures, coma, and of course, death. Now, as a Basset Hound owner, I look at some of those things like drooling and so forth. My Basset does that a lot. It's why you need to be able to compare normal behavior with excessive behavior. You need to know what your dog does normally. What is normal for your dog? Time is extremely important. The prognosis is almost always better when the poisoning is identified sooner rather than later. Once clinical signs of poisoning are seen, the cost and duration of hospitalization are more costly and longer, and the prognosis is worse. So what are these toxins that you need to be aware of? I'm glad you asked. Knowing about these can save your dog's life. Obviously, limiting access to any of these toxins is very important. The first toxin I'll mention is vitamin D3. Many of us are deficient in vitamin D levels due to the lack of sun exposure. We often supplement them with multivitamins that contain vitamin D, which comes in many forms. Sometimes we're even told by our doctors to take extra vitamin D supplements. I have to do that. While low levels of vitamin D are very safe, this vitamin can be very poisonous when ingested by dogs. In addition to these vitamin D supplements, some beauty products contain vitamin D as well. So check labels. Make sure you know what's on the label and make sure you keep anything that has vitamin D in it away from your dog. Vitamin D can also be found in mouse and rat poison, but it should be obvious that you could keep those away from your dogs anyways. Non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, or what we commonly call painkillers, can be dangerous to your dog. Most of you know that you should never give any human over-the-counter medication without consulting with your veterinarian, right? Well, if you didn't know that, you know that now. That's because common human drugs, including over-the-counter painkillers like Advil, Aleve, aspirin, and Motrin, and others, can cause serious harm to pets when ingested. They may cause stomach and intestinal ulcers as well as potential acute kidney injury, which could result in renal failure. Even veterinary painkillers, while safer than human drugs, can result in similar problems when ingested in large amounts. That's why it's so important to keep chewable veterinary prescription painkillers out of the reach of your dog. These veterinarian prescribed painkillers can even be toxic in prescribed amounts. So contacting your veterinarian if you see any changes in your dog's behavior is very important, especially vomiting after they've received one of those pain-killing drugs. It's just one of those things that you need to watch out for and be familiar with your dogs and what they do and don't do on a normal basis. The next thing on the list is cardiac medications. Now, I take some for my heart. Certain heart medications include broad categories of drugs such as calcium channel blockers and beta blockers. These medications are commonly used in both human and veterinary medicine to treat underlying cardiac disease or hypertension. Each category of cardiac medication has different margins of safety. Poisoning with these types of medications can result in a life-threatening low heart rate and severe hypertension. Secondly, acute kidney injury can be potentially developed as a result of taking those drugs. Both have a low margin of safety. Now, the next thing on the list is ethylene glycol. That's antifreeze. Most of you use antifreeze in your vehicles. Ethylene glycol is extremely poisonous to dogs. Sources of ethylene glycol include automotive antifreeze and radiator coolants, which typically contains 95% of the ethylene glycol. Windshield de-icing agents, motor oils, hydraulic brake fluids, paints, solvents, etc. all contain ethylene glycol. When Bonnie was diagnosed with possible antifreeze poisoning, I was amazed at the amount of products that we have in our homes that contain ethylene glycol or antifreeze. Just about anything that's liquid that you have in your house can contain that. And I even found this in toothpaste. Toothpaste even has antifreeze. Now, most of the liquids in your house may have propylene glycol antifreeze instead of ethylene glycol. I'll say more about that later. According to some of my sources, as little as a tablespoon of ethylene glycol can result in severe acute kidney injury in dogs and result in renal failure. While there is an antidote for antifreeze poisoning, it must be given within 8 to 12 hours to be effective. Once a dog has acute kidney injury from ethylene glycol, it's too late for the antidote. Unfortunately, the prognosis is poor to grave without referral to a specialty center for hemodialysis to flush out the kidneys. A friend of mine recently asked, why would a dog ingest antifreeze? The answer is simple. It's sweet. It has a sweet taste that they like. Some sources stated it's irresistible to dogs. At one point, 17 states had passed laws mandating the inclusion of a bittering agent in antifreeze, but multiple attempts to pass a federal law failed. It's estimated between 10,000 and 90,000 animals are poisoned each year after ingesting ethylene glycol in antifreeze and engine coolant. It's vital that consumers continue to read labels and follow instructions on proper use, storage, and disposal of antifreeze. Today, all major makers of antifreeze are putting bitterant in their antifreeze in all 50 states in the United States. For those in other countries, you need to investigate the use of ethylene glycol in antifreeze and engine coolant in your country. Some have banned its use. Now, propylene glycol-based antifreeze is much safer to use and a good replacement for ethylene glycol. Propylene glycol-based antifreeze is considered non-toxic. Ultimately, the best way forward is probably for all of us to switch to propylene glycol versus ethylene glycol-based antifreezes. The option is more expensive, though, so many experts doubt it will ever happen until sometime when the United States and maybe your country just ban it altogether. And perhaps that's never going to happen because just look how long it took the manufacturers to add 3 cents worth of bittering agent to conventional glycol-based antifreeze. I left the following for next to last in my coverage of toxins. According to the veterinarian who worked with Bonnie at the hemodialysis unit, she stated one of the biggest causes for the toxin cases that they see is grapes, raisins, and currants. Grapes and raisins have been associated with the development of renal failure after ingestion. This includes organic grapes, commercial grapes, homegrown grapes, seedless or seeded grapes, and common kitchen items, including them like Raisin Bran, trail mix, chocolate-covered raisins, cereal with raisins, fruit salad containing grapes, literally anything containing raisins or grapes. Grapes and raisins seem to stay in the stomach for a prolonged period of time and are not rapidly broken down in the body. So your veterinarian may try to induce vomiting even hours after a dog has ingested these poisonous fruits. Unfortunately, the exact dose of poisonous grapes and raisins is debated, as not all dogs develop poisoning from them. When in doubt, make sure to keep these common food items out of the reach of your dog and teach your little ones, your children at home, not to give poisonous foods to your dog. And certainly the last on the list of my toxins is that just about any prescribed drug can also be possible cause for problems including renal failure. In Bonnie's case, thanks again to the extensive research performed by a veterinarian, we're as sure as we can be that Bonnie's renal failure was caused by an antibiotic that he had been prescribing for many years. Obviously, he stopped using it after Bonnie's illness. In her case, it was a sulfa-based antibiotic. On Bonnie's medical chart folder, our vet placed a big, bright yellow sticker stating, quote, "No sulfa-based drugs," end quote, and we made sure that it was also added to the charts of any of the dogs that were related to Bonnie and even the rest of our Bassets. I need again here to say that this was a rather unique and isolated situation. It is not to be meant in any way or construed to be medical advice. It's just one of those things that happened and there was no way to foresee it. This same kind of issue can happen with many prescribed drugs. That's why they require a veterinarian to prescribe them. I know many dog owners who don't always go through their veterinarian to use the drugs that they give to their dogs, and they don't always get a prescription from their vet. And they're taking a big chance that they might end up with having something like renal failure happen to their dog. We all need to be aware of the risk that's involved when we give any kinds of medications to our dogs. In conclusion, when in doubt, pet owners should always keep all of these common household products and food products out of the reach of their dogs. Severe acute injury and total renal failure are not things that I think you would want to go through with your dog. If you have any reason to believe that your dog has been poisoned, contact your veterinarian and/or emergency veterinarian right away. You may also do the following if possible to save your dog's life. Call the ASPCA Poison Control, and the number there is 888-426-4435. That's the ASPCA Poison Control. Their number is 888-426-4435. There's also in the United States the Poison Helpline at 855-764-7661. That's 855-764-7661. There may be other poison-related hotlines that are available where you live, especially those who live in other countries. And or take the dog immediately to an emergency veterinarian facility. I can't stress how quickly you need to act in the case of your dog taking some medication that they shouldn't have had, or some kind of food or other toxin. The sooner you find out that your dog has been poisoned, the sooner you can get help to reverse it. It's also important to remember that possible poisoning includes ingesting any medications that aren't prescribed for your dog and any medications that were prescribed for the dog and the dog becomes sick, as I've described earlier in this episode. If in any doubt, make the call. I realize that sometimes that these services may cost money, but getting answers quickly may save your dog's life, and which is more important. I remember one morning, someone in our house, and I can't remember who it was, dropped a pill on the floor, and one of the dogs quickly snapped it up. We quickly identified the pill that had fallen on the floor and called one of the pet poison helplines, as well as an emergency vet office that's near our home. Both of them agreed that the type of pill wouldn't harm her. I won't say more because I don't want you to misconstrue this as medical advice. What's important here is that you need answers fast. The quicker you get a necessary treatment on your dog, the better their chances of recovery. It's just that important. Now, if you have any questions or concerns, you should always visit or call your veterinarian. They are your best resource to ensure the health and well-being of your pets. Since I've been talking about toxins that affect dogs, while this one doesn't really involve renal failure, I need to mention it here. It's a type of peanut butter that's become much more popular these days. And it can also be in other nut butters, and that's becoming popular because it contains less sugar. The makers have substituted xylitol as a sweetener. That's xylitol spelled Xylitol. That's spelled Xylitol. You need to know that, and you need to look at labels. This is a chemical that many brands have used, especially in sugarless gum. Xylitol can be deadly to dogs. I know many people, including us, who use peanut butter as a dog treat, or they disguise medications in it. Those of us who have dogs need to make sure that the peanut butter and other nut butters that we use do not contain xylitol, and we are careful to read labels of all foods that contain artificial sweeteners. If I say more about xylitol, it will be another episode where I can talk more about the other toxins that affect dogs. For now, that's something that we'll look for in the future, and I need to research more. Now, I hope you enjoyed this episode and learned more about Bonnie and renal failure. We loved Bonnie. She was a great dog. I'll tell more about her and how well she did in the show ring later on, and the puppies that she gave us. Bonnie was a very wonderful part of our family, and we loved her dearly. She was our first dog that was out of one of our dogs, and that was very special to us. In the next episode of WOEBGON, the Basset Hound podcast, I have some extremely important information that all of you need to know because our breed is under attack. Our breed is under attack by governments around the world, especially in Europe and now even in the United States. And we need to be very vigilant about what's happening about Basset Hounds and government relationships between breeders and the government. It's really sad. We're also under attack because we're losing a lot of breeders. Most of our reputable, responsible breeders that we've had have disappeared. They've disappeared because they've passed away or they've gotten to the point like Pam and I have where they've retired from breeding because they can't do it anymore. I'd like to challenge all of you to think about that. If you really love the breed, think about becoming a breeder. I'll talk more about that in the next episode, but It's something for you to start thinking about. And I hope you appreciate this podcast. I greatly appreciate all of you. I'm still waiting for questions. If any of you have any questions about the breed, please make sure you let me know. Give the podcast a thumbs up on YouTube and a high rating wherever you listen to the podcast. Those things are extremely important for the podcast and will help spread it to others. And thank you all very much for listening.
WOEBGON the Basset Hound podcast is published in visual form on YouTube the first Monday of every month. A full-length audio version of each episode is published 1 week later wherever you listen to podcasts. Check out our WOEBGON Basset's website for show notes including photos from every episode. You can also find links to the podcast plus information on Don and his wife Pam plus their Basset Hounds. WOEBGON the Basset Hound podcast is produced, researched, and hosted by Don Bullock. The music is Do Your Ears Hang Low played by Nasrality from the Philippines. It's available royalty-free on Pixabay. Please give this podcast a thumbs up on YouTube and a high rating wherever you listen to podcasts.
Until next time, this is Don. Thank you very much for listening.